tomorrow. So as he mentioned, I have been studying Mrs. Greenhow for 25 years. I am a musicologist by training, so essentially I am an historian of music, but my interest in her predates even that. I was still in my late teens when I began studying her. And the book was, for me at first, just an exercise for myself. It had never received much scholarly attention. I began going through and notating the names, the historical references, the literary references, just for my own sake, for my own research. But gradually I realized that what I was doing was compiling the first scholarly edition of the book. For anyone who may not be familiar with Rose O'Neal Greenhow, she was, depending on your perspective, one of the most famous or infamous Civil War spies. She was quite careful about not revealing her age. In fact, when she was under oath in a land claims case in California, and she was asked that question, her response was that she was of legal age to testify. Numerous scholars have spent years trying to find her exact birth date, and I think she would be very gratified to know that we still have not found it. We know the age of her younger sister. We have an exact birth date for her, so she must have been born sometime before that. We also have a record from when she was crossing the Isthmus of Panama, which gives her age at that point. Whether that was truthful or not is another question. But based on those things and based on some census information that we believe is a record of her at a relative's home as a teenager, at that point, only the head of the household's name was in the census, I believe she was born somewhere around 1814 to 1815. You'll find dates anywhere from 1813 to 1817 in various sources, but my research indicates that specific window as the most likely. Her father died when she was very young, and she was sent to live with her mother's sister and her mother's sister's husband in Washington, D.C. She was immersed in the political milieu of the capital from the time she was a teenager. Her husband worked for the State Department. He was a Virginian. And her sister had married the nephew of James and Dolly Madison. So through that connection, she had this very personal relationship with Dolly Madison, who was in a lot of ways a mentor to her from the standpoint of her work as a society hostess. Her elder sister married into the Peter family, which was connected to the Washingtons, the Custuses, and the Lees. And her sister, who married James Madison Cutts, had a daughter who was the second wife of Senator Stephen Douglas. So the family was extremely well connected. We see this in Rose's seized correspondence in the National Archives, but she also indicates in her book that she destroyed some of her most important documents. So who knows what else there would have been if that had not happened. Her political mentor was John C. Calhoun. And this was really a rather unusual relationship. You'll see throughout some quotes in italics. These are from her 1863 memoir. She says of Calhoun that he had been the intimate friend of my husband and often our guest, having remained several months at a time during his senatorial sojourn at Washington. For many years, I had been honored by a correspondence with him, and it was my privilege to sit by his bedside and minister to his wants during his last illness, and to treasure in my heart his words of wisdom. And when he died, I followed his remains as one of his children to his last resting place. What is curious about this is that she talks about the connection through her husband. What she does not mention is that she had known Calhoun before her marriage. He was one of the politicians who sometimes resided at her aunt and uncle's boarding house. There were a number of other connections to Rose. Her friend Lily McCall, who was later imprisoned in her home, was born at the house that Calhoun had previously owned in Washington. And Rose's eldest sister, Susan O'Neal Peter Leonard, named her only son John Calhoun Peter. So there was a long family connection there. Calhoun died at Rose's aunt and uncle's boarding house in 1850. And as she mentioned here, she was at his bedside. She discusses it at length in her narrative, the things that he said to her as he was dying. That same building later became the old Capitol Prison where she was incarcerated. I don't think it's a secret that she was a Confederate agent. And when questioned on that fact, she said, if this were an established fact, you could not be surprised at it. She was recruited by Thomas Jordan, West Point class of 1840, before he resigned his commission in the US Army in the spring of 1861. Jordan was not yet at that time on General Beauregard's staff. He had been sent by John Letcher of Virginia to establish this espionage network in Washington, D.C. And when Jordan later was appointed to Beauregard's staff, Rose began to communicate with the general through Jordan. She is best known, of course, for obtaining the Union Army's orders in advance of the First Battle of Manassas. But she makes a number of other claims in her narrative about the work that her espionage organization did. She says that federal officers and high-ranking politicians were induced to share secret information. She had verbatim reports of Lincoln's cabinet meetings, and we'll come back to who might have been the source for that in a moment. She had maps of the defenses of Washington. She warned John C. Breckinridge and William Preston that they were about to be arrested so that they could leave Washington and evade arrest. And she also says that McClellan was forced to change his plans 4 times because of the work of her espionage organization. Here are some of the suspected sources of military information. Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, who usually bears most of the brunt of the blame. Captain John Elwood of the Provost Guard, General Erasmus Keyes, whose grave happens to be at West Point, and I visit it pretty often. Buried next to him, oddly enough, because we're running out of room in the cemetery, is a woman whose funeral I played for. But what about those cabinet sources? That is very intriguing to me. Not long after her great success in July of 61, Rose was arrested, August 23rd, 1861. Alan Pinkerton and his agents were operating under orders from the Departments of War and State. Now, in her narrative, Rose seems to feel that Secretary of State William Henry Seward, who had been a personal friend of hers, was directly responsible for her arrest. But that was not actually the case. The official order was given by the Assistant Secretary of War, Thomas A. Scott. She didn't know that, and she blamed Seward personally. She was confined first in her home and then in the old Capitol Prison from August of 61 until June of 62. And this is that iconic Brady studio image of Rose and her youngest daughter, little Rose, the only one who was still at home at that time, who turned 9 years old in the prison. She was not officially a prisoner, little Rose, but she was subject to all the same rules as the prisoners. Rose Greenhow never was brought to trial. And she says that that was because she would have defended herself and there would have been rich revelations, which would have been very damaging to the government. She did receive a hearing before the US commissioners for the trial of state prisoners. Her account of that is in her book. The transcript from the hearing was recently rediscovered. And what is astonishing is that her memory of what occurred and the transcript are extremely similar, not identical, but that shows us that she had a very good memory and that she was striving to record her experiences as accurately as possible. Following her release, she was in Richmond, first at the Ballard House and then rented rooms. She was in very precarious health at that point. Jefferson Davis said that she was much changed and had the air of one whose nerves were shaken by mental torture. Most biographers view this year between her release and her diplomatic mission to Europe as a period of recovery. Yet in my investigation of this, I have found that she was much more active than many people have realized. She was traveling. For example, she was in Winchester, Virginia from September 15th to 21st, just at the time of the Battle of Antietam, which was less than 50 miles away. Now, the conditions of her parole were that she was to remain in Confederate territory, which Winchester was for the moment, at least, but that was about as close as she could get to Maryland. Remember, she was a Marylander. If Lee had been successful in his aim to take Hagerstown, she would have been perfectly placed to go right back into her home state if Maryland had risen as they anticipated. In June of '63, she wrote from Richmond that she was going to sail to Bermuda from Wilmington. But then we find her in Charleston, South Carolina in July, coincidentally, once again, during a fairly major engagement, the Second Battle of Charleston Harbor, having a personal audience with General Beauregard. She was unable to run the blockade from Charleston, so she departed for Wilmington from there on July 24th and sailed for Bermuda on the Phantom on the night of August 5th through 6th, beginning her diplomatic work in Europe. As Stephen Mallory termed her, the ambassadress. She was a diplomatic envoy, and this was absolutely an official government position. She met with leading politicians in Britain, and she had a private audience with Emperor Napoleon III in France. She also writes in her European diary that she was permitted to attend a French diplomatic dinner, which was only for the diplomats by special arrangement with someone who just happened to take her in and seat her at the table. So while France did not officially recognize the Confederacy, they were doing a lot of things to honor Rose's status as an envoy. She worked extensively with other Confederate agents in Europe, including in particular James D. Bullock. Little Rose, who had endured so much during her prison experience, was enrolled in a convent school in France. And there are rumors that Rose herself was engaged to Granville George Lucengore, the second Earl Granville. There is no conclusive proof of this, but she did know him. She knew his family very well. And that is rather intriguing because he was one of the major British politicians who was opposed to recognizing the South. While there, she published her book. This is my personal copy. The book is extremely rare, and it took me years to find a copy. Anne Blackman, who wrote the biography of Rose Wild Rose, whose book tour I was involved with a number of years ago, hired a rare book dealer to find hers. I just watched eBay for years and years. And when it finally came up and there was a buy it now option, click, and it was mine. The publisher was a very well-respected one, Richard Bentley, who had published works by Dickens and Disraeli and the first English edition of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. But they don't seem to have taken a great deal of time or care with Mrs. Greenhow's book. She had not been in England for a terribly long time when it came out, and there were signs that it was rushed to press. There was some sloppy editing, there were some misspellings, there were some things that her British editor didn't quite know what she was referring to and didn't quite get it right. And that was a big portion of my work in compiling the footnotes for the book, to find out what it was she really was saying. In many cases, the names were misspelled, and to identify those people. She did not talk much about her book in her European diary. In fact, there are whole swaths of time, up to a month at a time, where she doesn't write anything at all in the diary. So this period of her life is very intriguing, and there's still much more there to explore. She departed from Scotland on board the Condor August 10th, 1864. And this is very likely the last photograph of her. The ship arrived in Halifax, left there on September 24th. So she was in Halifax for more than 2 weeks, which is also very intriguing to me. What was going on there? This was a period of time when there was a great deal of Confederate activity in Canada. Passengers on the Condor when it left Halifax included James Holcomb and Lieutenant Joseph D. Wilson, formerly of the Alabama, who is almost certainly the man in this picture. This bears a very strong resemblance to known images of Wilson in uniform. She drowned October 1st, 1864, as the Condor attempted to run the blockade. And she is buried here in Oakdale Cemetery, given full military honors at burial. Here are some of the very intriguing things that I discovered in compiling the book. Her meeting with future Confederate nurse Fanny Beers in 1861, her family connections with Visitation Academy in Georgetown and its founder, Archbishop Neal. This was a fun one. Her first cousin, the Union General. How did the biographers miss that one? The connection of a prisoner shooting at the old Capitol to John Wilkes Booth. Her legal strategy, which was very, very clever. And if she only could have gotten an attorney who was willing to do what she wanted him to do, it would have been quite a scandal, I think. I investigated those alleged cabinet sources. I looked at correspondence between the Seward and Greenhow families, including a very odd letter that Rose's eldest daughter wrote to Seward in 1864, while her mother was on her diplomatic mission for the Confederacy in Europe. Potential identification of the diplomat who was with Mrs. Greenhow just prior to her arrest. The espionage ring's involvement with the Battle of Port Royal. And I was able to identify many members of the spy ring and prisoners at the old Capitol. So let's take a look at just a couple of those points. This is her first cousin. She writes in My Imprisonment, many members of my immediate family sided with the despot and held high official position under him. Biographers have noted that those include her nephew and her son-in-law, but nobody mentions her first cousin, Union General Bennett Hoskin Hill. Not only was he her cousin, but he was the son of the aunt and uncle with whom she had lived from the time she was a teenager. West Point class of 1837, which makes him a classmate of Bragg, Early, Pemberton, and Hooker. Classes were much smaller then. There were only 50 men in that graduating class, so they all knew each other. He was a career Army officer, Mexican War veteran, and he retired from active service in 1870 and is buried in Washington, D.C. He never married, had no descendants. They were related on the maternal side, and I think there is a very definite resemblance here. The connection of John Wilkes Booth with the prisoner shooting at the old Capitol. Rose writes about Mr. Wharton of Maryland, who was murdered in cold blood by a sentry. This is all the information she gives us about the identity of this man. I found that he was Jesse Barnes Wharton, a former US Army officer who was arrested in '61 and was shot by Ambrose Baker, an old Capitol guard, on April 18th, 1862, which happened to be Good Friday. Now, Booth's sister, Asia, indicates that not only did Booth and Wharton go to the same school, they were personal friends. So the coincidence of Good Friday and the death of Jesse Wharton is curious, if nothing else. Now, the suspects. Rose states, I might almost be said to have assisted at Lincoln's cabinet councils from the facilities I enjoyed having verbatim reports of them. So who was leaking information in the cabinet? Gideon Wells was practically her neighbor. He lived right around the corner from her on Lafayette Square. When she was arrested, fragments of letters to Salmon Chase and William H. Seward were found partially destroyed in her library. Her brother-in-law, James Madison Cutts, her sister Ellen's husband, the nephew of James and Dolly Madison, worked in the Treasury Department. So we have Wells, Chase, and Seward as potential suspects here. But several additional factors point to Seward. She writes, "I had known Seward intimately, and he had frequently enjoyed the hospitalities of my table. In compiling the index for my imprisonment, the number of references to Seward was absolutely astonishing. And it was deeply personal, her anger against him. There was an infamous incident when Charles Francis Adams, the son and grandson of presidents, and his wife said some rather inappropriate things about John Brown at Rose's dinner table. Seward helped smooth things over. Rose's eldest daughter, Florence, wrote to Seward over the span of a number of years. These letters are in the Seward family correspondence. They were all friends, the Sewards, the Greenhows, and the British minister, Lord Napier, and his wife. Rose states, "Mr. Secretary Seward, who in the morning is the most reticent man, is after supper and under the influence of the generous gifts which the gods provide, the most genial and confidential. I have often had occasion to admire the confidingness of his nature on these occasions, and wondered if the judgment of the world was correct in ascribing to him the character of a subtle schemer and tortuous intriguer." Now, obviously, she is a biased source. So I wondered if I could find any corroborating evidence. And lo and behold, I did. Charles Francis Adams, Jr., certainly far more of a Sewardite, very much a friend of the family, wrote about the same time. At times, his brandy and water would excite him and set his tongue going with dangerous volubility. So we have both Mrs. Greenhow's word and young Charles Francis Adams' word that Seward was drinking a little bit too much and not watching what he was saying in this period. He lived a 5-minute walk away from her house in the former clubhouse on Lafayette Square, which had connections to the shooting of Philip Barton Key by Dan Sickles, in which Rose was also involved. She knew everybody, really. She wrote to Seward several times during her imprisonment, but he does not ever seem to have answered. Prior to her arrest, in '61, her California attorney said, "Perhaps, after all, thanks to Seward and Wilson," that would be Henry Wilson, the Massachusetts senator, "you may do more with the incoming than with the outgoing powers." Pretty striking, given that she was a close friend of James Buchanan and had spent the summer of 1849 at his house with her children. We have correspondence indicating that she is seeking to advance candidates to the cabinet for Lincoln, and also seeking to obtain appointments for her son-in-law through Seward. And she writes of her own daughter, her eldest daughter, Florence, "His wife, as you know, is a Sewardite. My good friend, I have this very much at heart. I will hold myself greatly your debtor if it is accomplished." That is one of the letters that she tried to destroy upon her arrest, likely to protect her son-in-law and her daughter. But Seward's copy is in the Seward family correspondence. She also points the finger very directly at him in regards to information she collected about the Battle of Port Royal. It was upon one of those festive occasions when the mind of the great statesman had been properly attuned, that he addressed himself to the task of indoctrinating a distinguished foreign representative and assuring him that in 30 days, a favorite period of his, the rebellion would be crushed out, demonstrating this melancholy fact by describing in detail this invincible armada and the devastating course it was predestined to take. This important information was conveyed to me by my little bird. Rose was under house arrest at this point. A number of members of her organization had also been arrested, and yet she was still gathering useful information and conveying it south. A number of biographers have asserted that this agent called My Little Bird was her youngest daughter, Little Rose. But how could Little Rose be overhearing conversations between Seward and a diplomat while she too was under house arrest? My Little Bird has to be someone else. This was, of course, in relation to the planned combined Navy and Army assault on the forts guarding Port Royal Sound in South Carolina. The captains of those ships did not know their destination until they sailed. And yet, Judah Benjamin knew exactly where they were going. How? My Little Bird and the Greenhow Jordan spy ring. When I first started working on the book, there is a very famous letter that Rose wrote to Seward in November of 1861 that was widely reprinted in the press. I wrote to the library that houses the Seward family correspondence looking for the copy of this that she actually sent to him, because the one in the newspaper was a different copy that she forwarded directly to Richmond. They didn't have it. But 2 weeks after the book went to press, that letter that had been in a private collection came up for auction. And in comparing that to what was printed, I found this paragraph that was not in the newspapers. My own convictions are that the only chance of our ever again being one people is in the capacity of the South to maintain herself. Then negotiations can be entered into for adjustment, which can bind us together stronger than ever, not as conqueror or conquered, but as brothers who have quarreled and are willing each to yield something for the blessings of fraternal intercourse once more. Now, this is not the sort of language that we find from her by the time she publishes My Imprisonment in England in '63. Did she really believe that at this point? Or was it merely that she really knew Seward and she knew that would be attractive to him? I suspect the latter. She also makes some other very strong statements in that letter. For example, you may prostrate the physical strength by confinement in close rooms and insufficient food. You may subject me to harsher, ruder treatment than I have already received, but you cannot imprison the soul. She wrote to Seward when her young friend Lily McCall was dying, asking to be able to go see her, and he refused. She wrote to him again in December of 1861, and within days of that letter, she and Little Rose were transferred from house arrest to the old Capitol prison. Now, what is interesting about that is that when they were moved to the prison, they were also taken away from the jurisdiction of the State Department and placed under the War Department. This is very likely Rose's eldest daughter, Florence. And there are a number of letters from her in the Seward family correspondence. Her husband was a West Point classmate of Seward's son, Augustus. Again, a very small class, 38 men. Obviously, they knew each other. Pre-war letters indicate that there was a close friendship between Seward and Florence, but this was the one that blew me away. May 13th, 1864. While her mother, who had written scathing letters to Seward during her imprisonment, which were widely published in the newspapers, was in Europe on a diplomatic mission for the Confederacy, after Rose had published a book which is full of deep and bitter anger towards Seward, Florence still felt that she could write to him and say that she was planning to visit Mama in Europe and would like letters of introduction from Seward to US ministers in London and Paris. Awfully cheeky of her. But she must have thought that there was a good chance he would do this. Otherwise, she wouldn't have bothered to send the letter. This is the line that really intrigues me. You know, you reminded me of your promise to take care of me. So I hope you will not think I am asking too great a favor. When was that promise made? And when did he remind her of it? We don't have his side of the letters. We only have her letters to him. So there are still some mysteries here. Why is it significant that she was transferred from being a prisoner of the State Department to a prisoner of the War Department? Well, because shortly before he became Secretary of War, she tried to hire Edwin Stanton to be her attorney. She writes, Mr. Stanton came also to see me. I had, of course, no idea of the position he was subsequently to hold in the abolition cabinet. Neither had he at the time. I now wish to employ him as my counsel to obtain a writ of habeas corpus. This he declined, accompanied by expressions of high appreciation and proffer of service in any other way, to which I, of course, attached no value. This was not Rose's first run-in with Stanton. They were connected through two of his high-profile cases. The Lemantor land claims case, which her husband, Robert Greenhow, had been investigating when he died in San Francisco, and the trial of Daniel Sickles for the murder of Philip Barton Key. Of course, Stanton was one of Sickles's defense team. Another of the attorneys was Philip Phillips, whose wife, Eugenia, was also under house arrest in Rose's house. Rose had been warned that she might face trial for treason, and so she was attempting to hire an attorney. She also wanted to directly challenge Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Stanton was known for his unconventional defenses. The Sickles case had been a huge media trial at that point. And if he had agreed to petition for a writ of habeas corpus in her case, it would have been an absolute sensation, but he refused. However, when she was in the old Capitol, she was under his jurisdiction and not Seward's. There are a number of scholars in recent years who have claimed that Rose Greenhow was not an effective spy, that the information she obtained was something that the Confederate Army already knew, and they were just being polite when they said she had done such great service. But when we look at contemporary accounts, we find something rather different. From both sides, Jefferson Davis and Allan Pinkerton considered her highly effective and extremely dangerous to the Union. The intelligence prior to the First Battle of Manassas was not the only thing her organization did. And she states that she destroyed her most important papers. So those who say, well, there's no evidence that she did anything else. Of course there's no evidence, because she made sure there wasn't. It was very incriminating if there had been evidence when she was arrested. Espionage is a murky world. And between her own destruction of her papers and Judah Benjamin's destruction of records, there's a lot that we just don't know. The Confederate government paid her $2,500 in recognition of her valuable and patriotic service, which was a much larger sum than any other female spy received. Was this just because they had all been friends in Washington before the war? I don't think so. I think it was recognition that what she had done really did matter. And then they sent her to Europe on a diplomatic mission, which was absolutely unprecedented. She was the first American-born woman to represent her government in Europe. They wouldn't have done that and funded it, and it was not cheap to support the lifestyle she was leading there, if they did not believe that she was a valuable asset. My book is the first scholarly edition of her memoirs. Why had this not been done before? I think in large part because she was a victim of her own legend. It became this romantic story of this femme fatale who seduced Union politicians. And so no one was really taking her seriously. Yet the woman we find in this book is absolutely brilliant, especially given that she had no known formal education. She knows literature, she knows history, she knows contemporary and historical politics. My introduction explains a great deal of this. The nearly 600 annotations provide the context that are necessary for a modern reader to understand her incessant name dropping. And there's also an appendix that discusses those very interesting letters from her daughter Florence to Seward. This is also the first edition of the book that has a full index, which I have long wanted. In 25 years of working with this material, having some way to just look up a page reference is absolutely invaluable to me, and I hope to others who are studying Mrs. Greenhow. I believed in this project, but I was absolutely shocked when just over a year ago, when it was released in May of 2021, it was the #1 new release in Amazon.com's US Civil War Women's History category. And I think the narrative really deserves more attention. This was a brilliant woman. This was a well-connected woman. And to hear her experiences in her own words, as someone who is absolutely a Washington insider, is an invaluable window into that moment in time. This is what the book looks like inside. It has illustrations. The footnotes are directly on the page, so you don't have to be constantly flipping back and forth to the end of the book or the end of the chapter. She often assumed that her reader would recognize references which may be obscure to the modern reader, and quite honestly, probably to a lot of her readers in the 1860s as well. So this edition attempts to rectify that. It is the product of more than 25 years of research on my part. I have presented first-person portrayals in 14 states in Washington, D.C. And when I met Anne Blackman prior to the launch of her biography, Wild Rose, we discovered that we had looked at a lot of the same unpublished sources. In the 15 years since Anne's book came out, I have continued to make new discoveries. Many of them are included